Hello, everyone. Our show, it is 1 o'clock. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute. So we'll be right with you. All right. Thank you very much, John. You going to get us started?
Yes, sir. Thank you for joining us, gang. My name is John Cannon. I lead the commercial real estate platform here for Pinnacle Financial Partners. Excited to be with you today. In considering today's topic, I'll admit historically it's not been an area where I've traditionally focused and not one that I've given probably as much thought as I should, but more recently it's gotten my attention as I've become aware of the billions in federal dollars that are available for private businesses who are willing to tangibly commit to greater sustainability. That combined with the fact that expectations around sustainable building and operations are on the rise and are of growing importance to developers, investors, as well as tenants. We want this to be an informative session. We're going to focus on the many financial benefits of sustainable building and operations, such as the additional financial incentives it provides to enhance a project's viability. It also can make a project more attractive to buyers, users, and financiers. We've pulled together a great panel for you today. We have experts in development, construction, as well as an engineer who helps people navigate the various sustainability incentives. They're going to speak about their experience, and hopefully we'll have some time left at the end for questions. So now I'd like to kick it back to my friend and colleague, Joe Bass. Joe is going to moderate our panel. Joe helps lead Pinnacle's corporate responsibility work and climate response. So with that, Joe, take it away.
All right. Thank you, John. One, I want to note to everybody, thank you for being here. Really appreciate your taking the time. We are recording this webinar. So if you find it informative and you would like to share it with others, you will get a link to the recording after the webinar is over. We have a Q&A function. You can see that on your screen there. We'll use the Q&A. I'll monitor and compile questions, and hopefully we'll have time for a couple at the end. We have a pretty good program, so we'll see how much time we have for questions at the end. But I want to move right into our panelists. We have great panelists with us today. I want to start with Remy Gross, who comes to us from RCP Companies. We have Shumpert from Calvetti Ferguson, that's accounting, and Arun Singh from Radial Capital. So I'm going to start today with Sean, who is an expert in all things federal incentives for development and construction. You know, Sean, most of the relevant financial benefits we see for sustainable practices are related to the Inflation Reduction Act and a lot of other federal programs. So can you give us kind of a 30,000-foot overview of those?
Sure, absolutely. So the Inflation Reduction Act was passed back in August of 2022. It represents the most significant action Congress has taken on clean energy and climate change policies. Somewhere on the terms of several $100 billion in investment into the clean energy and emissions reductions. And kind of the stated purpose of the Inflation Reduction Act was to make sure that the United States stays the global leader in clean energy technology, manufacturing, and innovation. And they put some pretty aggressive goals there, such as having 80% clean electricity by year 2030, and then cutting emissions by 40% compared to our 2005 levels by 2030. And so we see a lot of incentives out there are actually allow your local governments, your tribal governments, and even tax-exempt entities to actually benefit from these tax credits in the form of direct payments. A lot of the laws we see in the Inflation Reduction Act are also placing an emphasis on locations and opportunities of these credits, so such as your energy communities, brownfield developments, low-income communities, and again, tribal communities as well. And with these incentives, we also see kind of a strong labor standards they're trying to enforce via the use of prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements that are tied to get these bonus rates of these incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act essentially uses tax credits and incentives in order to deliver a lot of these investments into clean energy. They also have grants and loan authority as well from the EPA and Department of Energy, but big portion of this is coming through the tax incentives. And they're primarily focused on your renewable electricity generation, energy efficient buildings, residential, commercial, and industrial, clean vehicles and alternative fuels, as well as your carbon capture and sequestration. Now, there's a lot of incentives out there that don't necessarily pertain to the real estate industry or the development industry, such as clean nuclear credits, clean hydrogen credits, electric vehicle credits. But there are some that are very substantial, impacting to the development and real estate side. And those would be your Section 179D, which is the energy efficient commercial buildings deduction. Section 45L, which is the credit for energy efficient homes, the investment tax credit for your renewable energy projects. And one that's not directly tied to the IRA, but is very important in all these projects is cost segregation as well.
So, I mean, the overall goal is to reduce emissions and then reduce kind of the immediate carbon footprint of a project, but also the ongoing carbon footprint of a project. Remy, you have a project right now underway in Huntsville that's very special. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you consider the immediate versus ongoing carbon footprint at the Wellery?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks so much for having me on the panel. So I help co-found and run a company called RCP Companies in Huntsville, Alabama. And one of the two master plan projects that we're working on right now has what we believe, at least from what we can tell via research, is the first operationally net zero mixed use multifamily building in the entire Southeast. And for us, this kind of came about through an LP, a source of capital that actually had a specific interest in sustainability, as well as community building and other things of the like. We'd always thought about it, about how to kind of incorporate either lower embedded carbon or low operational carbon buildings in our projects. In Huntsville, when you're governed by TVA, which has such favorable energy pricing, and there aren't any other additional state incentives to kind of tee up, we had always kind of thought it would be far afield for us to do that. But the Wellery takes advantage of the things that Sean just mentioned, the IRA 179 and 45, that allow us to kind of put together something that not only we think meets the growing consumer demand, but also brings a resiliency factor to the project, heightens the amenities, and gives us a higher value asset. So the way we built the Wellery, or are building the Wellery, is with a very thoughtful approach to reducing the embedded carbon and the amount of carbon it would take to actually produce, provide, and construct the raw materials into the building. The operationally net zero component is what we focused on to get to net zero, and that is by net zero, I mean we are producing or sourcing as many renewable electrons as are being used in the building. And we were actually able to kind of piece that together in a couple of different ways, by using photovoltaics or solar cells and battery for storage, and then also utilizing a novel program that TVA has that's incredibly cost efficient, that allowed us to basically procure cheap renewable electrons for each of the 320 tenants that will exist at the Wellery. So those were the two kind of thought processes we had and work streams we had, trying to lower the embodied carbon in the construction and in the materials of construction of the building itself, and then having us be operationally low carbon or zero carbon. We thought a lot about where, reused rebar and recycled steel, things like that. We looked at low carbon concrete. Huntsville's not an area that has low concrete providers, or low carbon concrete providers, I should say. So there was a bit of it was a bit of a challenge. We had to scrap that. So kind of balancing the consumer demand for this type of product, and also the costs and what that would do to our overall cost of construction, or ultimately our yield on cost, was incredibly important. So the interesting thing is that as more people do this, we've already seen, since we locked in pricing, the prices of certain of these components have actually continued to go on down, and that's super interesting. Despite, I think, lower construction in general across the nation, but more supply, rather, as people come into the market to try and fill these demand gaps.
So Arun, you've been on the investment side of this through private equity for commercial real estate. What did you learn about investors' appetites for sustainable practices and projects?
Sure. So I'm currently the CEO of Radial Capital, which is an advisory firm focused on debt borrowing. But I spent almost the last 5 years at MDH Partners, which is a real estate private equity firm based out of Atlanta, investing in industrial real estate. And when most people think about ESG private equity, they don't think about industrial. And one thing that made us a little bit more unique is we had a very unique capital source. We were investing only on behalf of university endowments and foundations. And what was really unique about this capital source is kind of the long-dated nature. There's a number of long-dated nature investors in the US, public pension plans, insurance companies, but the universities, who were our core capital source, were actually substantially older than all those entities. We're talking over 200 plus years old. And when they're thinking about investing today, they're thinking about the next 300 years and how they can secure the operations of the university through smart investing. And so what really it came down to is these investors like to think about how to do things differently. And so I kind of think about their mindfulness of ESG is a little bit more like European, which is on the leading edge of the passive LP investors, of how they want to think about investing. And just like Remy said, sometimes the LP investors are the ones that drive the ship on how you invest. So our mantra, or our investment thesis, was to buy and develop industrial real estate. Our marching orders from our investors were continue doing that, and we need to maximize returns. We also need you to maximize your ESG impacts without giving up any returns, without any sacrifice. And it wasn't just on the environmental, but also on the social and governance. And so we really were able to capture it on thinking outside the box, because we're kind of, trying to create something very special with no budget, and makes you think outside the box. And I'm actually very thankful they gave us those orders, because we probably wouldn't have found some of the unique products that we'll talk about later, and the unique strategies without that. So it's really interesting to see how LP capital base can really help change the strategy, but maybe for the better for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've dealt with investors who prefer sustainable practices in their projects, but as John said at the beginning, it's just not top of mind for everyone. But it sounds like for even those who don't, the incentives and the benefits could potentially drive projects into positive ROI. So Sean, what is the government looking for in these projects, and how are the tax incentives structured, and what kind of requirements or limitations do they bring?
Sure. I'll briefly cover a few of the incentives I mentioned earlier, starting with Section 179D. That's the energy efficient commercial property deduction. Now, this is not a new incentive. It was actually signed first into law in 2006. And what it does is it provides accelerated depreciation for commercial building owners, as well as a deduction for designers of public projects and tax-exempt entity projects. Now, this incentive applies to new construction and renovations of existing buildings, provided that they touch one of the three required sets of the deduction, which would be HVAC and hot water systems, your interior lighting systems, and the building envelope. Now, what's changed with the Inflation Reduction Act is actually the increased maximum deduction. Now, this is a per square foot deduction rate. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, it was $1.88 per square foot. It's now jumped all the way up to $5 per square foot, plus an inflation adjustment rate for projects that meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. Okay. The other thing that it did too was this used to be a one-time deduction, meaning if you performed a 179D deduction on your building one time and you got the maximum benefit, you can never again analyze that building, no matter if you've made improvements or not. Well, this now is able to be reset every 3 to 4 years to kind of encourage these increased upgrades to the buildings to make them more energy efficient. Like Remy was discussing now, there's coordination with other incentives, such as 45L is now allowed as well. Now, how 170 is calculated is an actual energy modeling will be performed that models the building as it stands today. And what you're doing is you're actually comparing that to a reference building that's built to the minimum ASHRAE standards of 2007 to determine your annual energy savings there. So as you can imagine, any projects that we're building now or we're renovating now, they have a lot more energy efficient features in them than what was to minimum code back in 2007. As part of the study, it must be certified by a licensed engineer or architect for where the building stands. And there's also a site inspection component for that. Next, the investment tax credit. Again, this is not a long-standing tax credit, but this was greatly enhanced with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's included a lot more eligible property now. So we've always thought of the investment tax credit for solar and your wind cells, and those sort of things. But now it includes energy storage, fuel cell property, geothermal systems, which we're seeing a lot of those systems come into play. And what this is if you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, or if your generation is less than 1 megawatts, your base credit is 30% of the eligible cost of the system you can get back as a tax credit. On top of that, they have some additional add-on credits that are 10% each. So if you have a certain amount of domestic content in those equipment you've installed, if you're installing this in an energy community area, or if it's a low-income community project, all those can add up to, you might be able to get a 60% credit on the actual eligible property that you're installing. And the next one I'd like to speak about, cost segregation. Now, it's not directly tied to the Inflation Reduction Act, but the cost segregation is a very important tool and should be performed on really any real estate, purchase, new construction, renovation, as long as the planned hold time is 3.5 years or greater from what we've calculated. If you're not familiar with cost segregation, I'll briefly break it down. It's when you buy a building, you're stuck depreciating that building over 39 years or 27.5 years for residential. What cost segregation does is it actually takes those components of the building and breaks them out into different, personal property and other, land improvement buckets. So you get assets in 5-year, 7-year, 15-year, and the remaining staying in 39-year. Well, we have bonus depreciation now too. Now this is slowly phasing out. It was 80% in 2023. It's now 60% in 2024, and it's set to phase out by 2027. But what bonus depreciation allows you to do is anything that's recategorized as a maker's life of 20 years or less, you can take those deductions the first year. So you can actually recapitalize your investment at a much quicker time period. And then lastly, 45L. This is the tax credit for builders of energy efficient homes. This was actually slated to go away in 2022, but the Inflation Reduction Act has actually extended this out to 2032. And it applies to single family homes, but it also applies to your apartments, condos, and other multifamily projects. What the Inflation Reduction Act also did is it removed the height limitation for 45L. So it used to be a multifamily residence could only be 3 floors or less. Now that height requirement is gone. And why that's important is Section 170D is for commercial buildings and high-rise residential. So you can actually use both these on the same projects if they meet the thresholds. As well as the credits have gone up. If you meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements, the credit is up to $5,000 for Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Home Certified dwelling units, and $2,500 for an Energy Star certified dwelling unit. So as you can tell, if you've got a large multifamily building that has these certifications, that's a lot of dwelling units and a lot of tax credits that are available. And just looking at all these incentives together, you can really piece together a project that can take advantage of almost all these incentives in order to get your cash back out of the investment and invest to other areas.
Yeah, Remy, you mentioned a lot of components there for operational carbon. Can you get into a little more detail about some of the strategies you've used at the Wellery?
Yeah, so happy to. So, I mean, Sean kind of just read the playbook, I think, really well as to what kind of drives it. And that's really jumps off of Aaron's comment that, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, LPs will have a desire, but obviously their primary fiduciary duty is return, right? And so how do you actually balance these things? So the process we went through was to do a fair amount of scenario planning as we were looking to, as we were doing design charrettes and doing kind of pre-development work on the Wellery project to kind of piece it all together and number one, see if this actually made sense, on its merits without any type of government incentive, and then with the government incentive to see what's possible and if something is possible, to what extent. And so we found a great design build firm. We worked with them. We used our accountants to help build a model to help us understand the complexities of the the IRA and the various components of it, to see on a net after tax basis, what does this actually look like, right? So for us, we had a lot of challenges, and we also had a lot of opportunities. To Sean's earlier point, everyone gets the 30% credit if they meet a couple of different hurdles. Our project is in a low income area, so there's another 10% credit, right? If you source domestic solar cells, for example, there's another 10% credit, right? Which gets you up to 50%. So we're 40%, right? So we're going to get a credit of 40% of the entire renewable investment cycling over the next tax year, right? So it's an amazing hit or return, if you will, right? As it relates to year one, right when you're actually getting started with operations. So taking into account these types of factors in there, and then working with the city of Huntsville to enable battery storage and hook up to the grid in a way that would allow us to sell back energy when it's not being used in the building in a certain way, was really key. There's a lot of diligence that needs to happen, right, in order for you to know that this works. I will say that for us, when we had third-party modeling done on it, we're at an IRR for this facet of the Wellery project that's higher than the multifamily building itself, and not by much, but it's still higher. It's still accretive to the overall equity multiple in IRR, right? And so while there is this, heightened and increased consumer expectation around greener, environmentally friendly things, we don't even have to worry about that, because we've been able to kind of, through this diligence, been able to devise a strategy that actually makes this work and work well on an economic basis, not to mention the resiliency factors and things like that for our product. So the environmental piece is fantastic, but it's not the only part of the calculus that, in our opinion, would make us do this. For all the other projects we have in pre-dev right now, we're also doing the same exercise to see if we can do a solar overlay. So we also had to spend a fair amount of time with TVA, right? TVA, for example, does not allow sub-metering. And therefore, so does the Huntsville Utilities in Huntsville, Alabama doesn't either. And so we had to figure out a way to kind of partner with TVA, as I mentioned earlier, to basically procure renewable electrons from their grid and count them toward the individual residences. It was really disappointing that we couldn't sub-meter, but since TVA is so far behind their mandate of 20% renewable generation, and I can't remember what the date is for that, maybe 2030, maybe it's earlier, but they're so far behind on where they need to be on that they actually have several projects that you can sign up to longitudinally and lock in kind of a favorable system now. So finally, the final thing I'll say about it, in addition to all this, is that the battery storage we see, then the resiliency piece of this, with an electric grid that seems to actually allow increasing number of outages with weather, that this is when we look at or talk to the existing residents of our multifamily projects, that type of resiliency is something that's actually increasingly important to them. And so this gives us yet another kind of, in this virtuous cycle, gives us another ability to kind of market and, allow people to know that you're in this place due to this kind of renewable overlay. It's safer. It's going to keep you, lit. It's going to keep the amenity areas open, and common areas, et cetera. And so for us so far, it's been a win-win-win.
All right, Aaron, I want to get your thoughts on the same question, but first I want to remind everyone, you can use the Q&A function to submit questions. We've had one asking if some of the items Sean is going over will be available in a printed form, and yes, he does have some one-pagers we can share, and we will put everybody's contact information back up on screen at the end of the session, so stay tuned. But Aaron, really same question, kind of how have you seen the dynamic of operational versus embedded carbon play out in your projects?
Sure. So industrial real estate makes things a little bit more fun where people think, oh, there's huge roofs. It should be pretty easy to put up solar. And the reality is operational carbon is much more difficult in industrial than it is embodied carbon. And so we just want to break that into what's the difference between the two, right? The embodied carbon is to get the building built. The operational carbon is how you operate it. And in most cases on industrial, the landlord does not control the meter or sub-meters. It all belongs directly to the tenant. And so the operational control and or anything we'd want to do all requires joint decisions with tenants. And sometimes that gets a little bit more complicated than you might think. What Remy is able to succeed on at his properties goes a long way, being able to control the entire development and operations thereafter, and also having common area utilities. And that's really one of the other challenges for operational as well, is that if a tenant doesn't necessarily believe they want solar or battery backup, there's only so much common area utility. So there's not like there's an easy answer for solar panels for the outside parking lot lights. And then to what Sean and Remy have both said, what's really interesting about the Inflation Reduction Act is that previous types of incentives were considered bad REIT income. And now the Inflation Reduction Act, that is no longer qualified in the formula. And now, so you can think about the public REITs, which is, those folks were already doing a lot of this. They're now going to be incentivized to do a lot more. But the private REITs, the really large owners of commercial real estate throughout the country, are now going to be really incentivized because, as Remy alluded to, the after-tax returns are pretty interesting. And if generally you think about the private REITs as having lower cost of capital, and they can be achieving mid-teens IRR, things are going to get pretty interesting pretty quickly. I think that's only going to accelerate how many private owners of real estate are going to be focused on the Inflation Reduction Act and all the other incentives. So if we want to talk about a real world project, at MDH, we had built 3 with a product called Carbon Cure. It's a Canadian-based product that captures CO2 and injects it into cement mix, and then it gets locked into the concrete when it cures as limestone. And you end up with actual concrete that's stronger than normal concrete. And it's just an amazing product and basically has a negative multiplier effect. So we built one building just east of Nashville's airport, but I'd rather talk about the one in Charlotte, which Pinnacle Financial Partners financed for us. It's a property called Huntersville Phase 1. It was 445,000 square feet across 2 buildings and 55 acres of forested land that we had to remove to build these buildings. Now, ripping out forest is not exactly the ESG friendly goal, but using the embodied carbon and using that concrete, which was our first time using it in that Charlotte property, it actually had a 5 times multiplier effect of the amount of carbon saved versus what the trees were saving. So that 55 acres of forested land, by embodying all that carbon back into the concrete, is the equivalent of 250 acres of forested land. So we actually are a carbon negative building. And that was our first time we ever went into that foray. And then thereafter, we actually created a partnership with Interface Flooring out of Atlanta to start using their carbon negative carpet. And it basically is cost neutral. And I should have mentioned Carbon Cure was also cost neutral. And it really matters about just being open-minded and being selective on product selection. And we since have worked with Mohawk as well on their carbon negative product. The reason those are carbon negative has to do with their supply chain, their recycling product, they're taking back and rebuilding the supply chain. It's actually pretty innovative. And so the ability to make all those small choices, I think, is really how it plays out of making these huge gains on the embodied carbon side.
I mean, that's fascinating to have carbon negative projects, especially that are so concrete intensive, and also cutting down trees. And that's really interesting on the building side. Remy, I know that you have looked a lot at the long-term value. There are long-term costs associated with operational carbon, as you've noted. But many developers are building to sell, not necessarily to operate on their own. So can you touch on the long-term value?
Sure. To the extent it's relevant for us, we tend to hold a lot and don't dispose of a lot of most of the projects that we develop. That having been said, when you spend a lot of time out in the capital markets, and you're also always talking to institutional and quasi-institutional potential dispositions for a building like this, it's always something you want to benchmark. And I think it's mixed between neutral and positive in terms of how people look at it. I think from a standpoint of attracting a potential universe of buyers. There are lots of groups, both public and private REITs, for example, to Aaron's point, where there's a push toward this, whether it's from their own LPs or shareholders, or whether they just see the resiliency factor, right, and the economics from what's probably going to be an accelerated energy costs going forward with general electrification of transportation and other things, that the market has been favorable toward this. As a matter of fact, as we look to do additional projects, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at going through the same process to see if we can set up a renewable overlay onto those. The several conversations with potential lenders and then institutional equity have all suggested that their dispositions have been easier for this. So in a place like Huntsville, Alabama, which is very, it's very technical, lots of scientists and engineers always liking the new things, but then a large government presence. You can actually see the federal government's, approach toward having both their buildings have a renewable component, or at least a green component to it. And the next stage of this, which has been big in the defense world, defense contracting world here in Huntsville, is that contractors to the U.S. government will be the next step, and with timelines for them to have their facilities do this. So we actually see this as a kind of a leading edge necessity that actually puts us in front of everybody else in terms of widening both the tenant base the potential cast of characters that we might talk to a disposition for. So plus I might also add finally, and Huntsville may be a little bit unique in this, although places like Nashville certainly aren't. When you have a town where 64% of the people are not from Huntsville, they're not from Alabama, they're from everywhere. Just the work that we've done in trying to educate people around this has been truly remarkable. And so the positive character, positive nature of the response has been fantastic. So again, for us, on our foray into this, it's been positive from all sides.
Yeah, and I mentioned you mentioned that you build to hold, but I mean, I have to think that all those things you just mentioned would make it more attractive to buyers and permanent financing.
Yes. Yes, everyone we've talked to, everyone we've talked to about how to apply this, the answer has been unequivocally yes. Also for the larger, more master planned projects that we're doing in Huntsville right now, where you have larger institutions that would comprise your universe of potential buyers. This is not a nice to have. For some of them, it is now a must have.
Aaron, do you agree with that? Do you think that these make it more attractive to permanent finance and future buyers?
Yes, 110%. I've actually worked with one really large bank that we were large clients of to help them figure out how to come up with a green lending program. It did take them almost 2 years to figure it out, but I think now that it's just starting to percolate now, and I think it's going to be more important in the future. And we're certain, I still maintain that I think there's virtually every fund or public REIT is basically under allocated to what they would consider green buildings, which it kind of doesn't make any mathematical sense if everyone's under allocated, because that means everyone's equally allocated. But everyone would like to be more allocated than what they are now to green buildings, and there's only so many to go around today, right? And so there's a lot of demand when something like that comes around, because there's somewhat of a unicorn of how unique they can be. At MDH, we had bought over 3 million square feet in 3 years of LEED, silver, or gold buildings. And it was like, when we saw that, we're like, this is awesome. This is exactly the type of buildings we want to own. So if we had seen more, we would have bought more.
So Sean, coming back to you, I read last week that in the lead up to the election, a lot of that Inflation Reduction Act money is going out the door as quickly as they can get it out. Do you think that's true?
That's Joe. That's kind of it's a tricky question. One being that there's no central database that's tracking the Inflation Reduction Act. If you remember, there was 4 major legislation bills in 2021 and 2022. The Inflation Reduction Act was one of them. You had the CHIPS and Science Act was another one. The American Rescue Plan, which is the pandemic relief bill, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So altogether, that's $1.5 trillion worth of federal spending that goes to these. So some things I have seen is roughly 60 billion of the 145 billion indirect spending has been tentatively funded. But a lot of the funding is actually coming through these tax incentives, and the total of those could be up to 525 billion. But there's no good way of actually tracking that. So I think a lot of money has been spent, but we're also seeing some turbulence in the electric vehicle space. Your large renewable energy projects, like your offshore wind projects, some of those are getting delayed or canceled just due to changing market conditions as well. But as far as the credits for the real estate markets, most of those incentives are either permanent fixtures of the tax law, or they have kind of hard set deadlines where they'll be phased out.
Clearly, though, as we've already talked about, the federal incentives aren't the only tools for finding value in sustainability. So what else do people need to be looking for? What else do they need to be doing when they're planning their next projects, Sean?
Sure. So, what Aaron and Remy talked about, there's been a lot of pushes from the public companies to kind of measure their carbon outputs and for other projects. Another thing to take in consideration is the localities, right? So we see a lot of cities and states are starting to impose some requirements, right? So New York City is setting emission caps on large buildings. Boston is requiring larger buildings to report their annual energy and water consumption now. Seattle has, interesting enough, a building tune-up policy, which is going to require commercial buildings that are over 50,000 square feet to perform a energy efficient tune-up every 5 years. You see, that works well for 179D if you're, as that deduction resets every 3-4 years. In Ohio, K through 12 schools are required to seek LEED Silver certification. So as Aaron mentioned, these LEED projects, there's a lot of tie-in with those and these incentives. Most LEED projects are going to have some sort of component of your energy modeling or your building sub-metering to actually measure your power consumption and your water consumption for projects. And for example, the LEED category, which is the environmental and atmospheric category, is a total of 33 points out of the 110 points total for LEED. So it's a huge component of it. So I think all those are kind of tying it together as we see these newer buildings being built for the long term.
Yeah, and I know that there are also a lot of options for older building retrofits, which is a whole other topic. And I think that is good material for a future session. Now, we've got a couple of questions in Q&A I want to get to, but first I want to close it out with you, Aaron. You've all done this for a while, and there's a lot to consider. We've barely scratched the surface, really. So, Aaron, how have you managed it in your work?
So it's a great question. There's two things I'd want to say. First is there's a lot of content we just talked about today, and we could have extended this to like a 10-hour panel. And the right way to be successful in this space, if you're interested, is taking a lot of small, manageable steps and taking the small wins. And so MDH's, I joined MDH in 2020, and I was tasked with putting together an ESG plan and figure out how we're going to run it. And our first plan was 6 pages. Which wasn't very long, but it ended up being a lot about what we were actually doing. And it was kind of in our DNA of like, this is what we've been doing for 20 years. It just was ESG friendly, especially on the environmental side. It just didn't have that name at the time. And we ended up submitting the next version of the plan to PRIA, and ended up winning a global award with PRIA for emerging manager. And the reality was, it wasn't like we were doing anything groundbreaking. Well, I guess maybe the Carbon Conquer kind of was, but the reality was, it was just talking about what we were doing and how we were doing it and measuring it. And it's not that complicated, but it was telling a really good story and not talking about what we were going to do. Because I think a lot of people can get over their skis on talking about what they want to do for the next 20 or 30 years. And if you're just starting out, it becomes a scary situation, and analysis paralysis as well. The second component is I was CFO of MDH Partners. So one of the voting investment committee members overseeing accounting, finance, capital markets, et cetera. And we thought it was important that we did not want to have a siloed component of the organization focused on ESG and sustainability. We thought it made a lot more sense to be a core cornerstone of kind of my role. And also it was a great intersection with my passion. So it was a win-win. It made sense that it would just sit with me. But then the reality is, organically over time, and every single investment committee, in the back of my head, I'm thinking, how does this fit into the policy? And it wouldn't say that it would change our outcome of the votes, but it became a consideration. And that's why I think it makes a lot of sense to have it with someone on the very senior management. When it ends up being siloed, I think sometimes it becomes more reactionary on, hey, did this group end up opining, as opposed to taking it all together in with the same voice. So that's another vote I'll have to make, kind of, every single day, little decisions and making little steps towards making progress towards it really goes a long way if you just are consistent over a couple of years.
All right. So I want to give people one more chance to put questions in the Q&A. We have a couple of them that we're going to touch on, but while we do that, I'm going to put contact information back up on the screen as promised. So here's how to get in touch with our panelists if you have follow-up questions after the event is over. So our first question is, Remy was touching on multifamily mixed-use projects. Are there certain stipulations around tax credits? This may be better for you, Sean. Are there certain stipulations around tax credits that you can receive for condos or condos with large-scale retail components?
So who should take that first, me or Sean?
Why don't you start, Remy?
Yeah, Sean, what do you think? No, just kidding.
I've had it, Remy.
So I'll try and make you proud, Sean. Not to my knowledge, how's that for an equivocal answer? As a matter of fact, I think there could be more benefits for, doing like single family, like a condo, but not having any direct experience on condos and having, done this on aggregated apartment, multifamily. Sean, what do you think?
You tend to see it's more on the multifamily side of the realm, but condos, it works as well. The main thing with condos is you can't, the unit itself has to be sold to another person or leased to another person before the developer who has basis in the building can claim that credit. So there's something to just keep in mind there. Just that intent to sell.
All right. Our next question is probably again for you, Sean. Is there a rule of thumb for how long to hold your asset to avoid recapture when dealing with cost segregation?
Yes, we've generally seen and through our done some calculations about 3.5 years is kind of the break-even point for cost segregation to avoid that. It's a time value of money game, and so about 3.5 years is kind of where that break-even point is.
All right. I don't see any other questions. So thanks to the three of you for the great information. And John, I'm gonna turn it back over to you.
Yeah, great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Panelists, thank you for some great content and information. We have recorded this session. Everyone in attendance should receive a link in the next day or two to access it. If you have any questions for us or would like to access our panelists, please reach out to your Pinnacle financial advisor. And with that, we'll conclude the program. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.